even though it had underlying problems such as inequality. On the other hand, the government's fiscal outlook was not great. It wasn't catastrophic, but it wasn't great. Part of that has to do with the Trump tax cuts in 2017, which lowered revenues, and I will be saying more about that and that component. But there are other factors as well, which I'll also be talking about. In any event, talking about what happened in 2020, those issues sort of we put to the side for the moment. Think about what has changed. So looking at our current measures, the deficit as it was in fiscal year 2020, which ended, the government fiscal years end September 30th of that calendar year. The government deficit in fiscal year 2020 was 15% of GDP. It is currently projected for the current fiscal year, which will be over on September 30th this year, to be over 10% of GDP. And that is not including any legislation that hasn't happened yet. So these forecasts are based on current law, meaning if we undertake a very big spending package as is currently being proposed by President Biden, this number will be higher. But as of now, built into law, the deficit is over 10% of GDP. So adding 2 years together, we've had deficits of 25%, little over 25% of GDP so far through less than 2 fiscal years. That's a lot, given that we started the period with debt to GDP ratio of about 80% of GDP. That is, it more or less increased the debt to GDP ratio by somewhere between a quarter and a third, just in a space of less than 2 years. The other thing, and talk about the size of these deficits, if you want to compare it to history and say, well, when was the last time the US government ran deficits this large as a share of GDP? The last time was during World War II. No peacetime, we've never run peacetime deficits, federal deficits this large. On the other hand, it's an unusual time. Another thing that's unusual is what happens if you look forward. So in a normal recession, or even a big recession, so for example, if you go back to the financial crisis, started at the end of 2007, carried through, well, ended officially in 2009, but the recovery took a long time after that. The deficit went up to about 10% of GDP, a little under 10% of GDP, and then slowly came down. And the reason why we expect deficits to slowly come down back to where they were before the recession happened are two things. First of all, we accumulate debt during the recession, and that debt requires debt service, and so the debt service adds to deficits for a while after that. The other thing is it takes the economy a while to recover. Unemployment rates may go up sharply, but they tend not to go down so quickly. And so we might expect it to be a few years, as it was in a decade ago, before the economy recovers. And yet, if you look at the current forecasts of CBO, they're projecting that deficits starting next fiscal year will actually be lower. And remember, we're dividing by the same GDP forecast. So the only thing that's changing here is the deficits in the numerator. They're projecting that deficits will actually be lower than they were forecasted a year ago. Now, how can that be? Well, one factor is that their CBO is projecting that the economy will recover very rapidly, much more rapidly than is typical from recessions. Normally you recover from a recession if it's at a certain rate, and if it's a deep recession, as this certainly was, then the recovery might be more rapid in terms of changes, but it'll still take you a long time to deal with an unemployment rate which was 15% in this for a time in the second quarter of 2020, and yet we're projecting deficits that are actually lower. Well, projecting the deficits will come back close to where they were is consistent with a fast recovery. Projecting that they'll actually be lower requires more of a story. And that story is a sharp decline in the interest rates that the federal government has to pay on its debt. Interest rates were low at the beginning of 2020. They're even lower now, especially for the federal government. And a way of seeing the contribution that additional factor makes, one can look not at the deficits, but at the primary deficits the government runs. That is, the deficits excluding debt service. So the interest component is taken out. And if you look at that, you see that the primary deficits are now pretty much on target. So what this is saying is the debt service component actually pulled down the deficit. So even though there's more debt being serviced, interest rates are so much lower than was previously being forecast that the overall debt service is actually lower than was being projected before. So you combine the sharp recovery with lower debt service, and you get the picture that I showed. Just a note to be discussed later, this is projecting primary deficits, that is deficits excluding debt service, of around 3% of GDP for the coming decade. And that's an important thing to keep in mind when we think about the sustainability of fiscal policy. Because if you like, debt service tells us something about what we did in the past, how much debt we accumulated, whereas primary deficits are telling us how our spending, other than debt service, and revenues align. And this is telling us that the CBO projections, again, based on current law, indicate that revenues will be about 3% of GDP lower than expenditures. And that does have implications for the sustainability of our fiscal policy. Another way of expressing how unusual these developments have been is to look at the contributions to the changes in the forecasts of the direct effects of legislation themselves and the worsening of the economy. In a normal recession, if you compare forecasts before the recession starts and after you're in the recession, what you'd expect to see is that the deficit being projected would go up because of the direct effects of legislation. That is, you cut taxes, you increase spending to try to deal with the recession. But you'd also expect, because revenues and spending tend to vary autonomously with the strength of the economy, that as the economy gets weaker, that would further contribute to the deficit. That's certainly true if you look back, say, at 2009. The deficit we experienced in 2009 was much higher than we expected, and about half of it was due to the legislation that we passed, and half of it was due to the weakening economy. Well, if you perform that exercise here, you get a very different story. Here's the effect estimated by CBO of the legislation itself. That is, how much did we spend? What were the tax cuts? We had huge increases in 2020, largely associated with what was called the CARES Act in March. The first time we'd had a multi-trillion-dollar fiscal relief package, as well as other legislation that we had. And then we've had other legislation so far, in particular in December in 2021, as well as the overhang from the CARES Act, which also increased deficits. And the legislative effects in subsequent years, the direct effects were very small because most of this legislation is temporary. That is, it wasn't meant to have any revenue or expenditure effects directly in the following fiscal years. Now, if you layer on the sort of the effects of the economy itself, they're actually negative. They actually reduce the deficit. Because number one, because the economy is recovering so rapidly, and also because debt service is going down. So that is, if you were trying to decompose the effects of changes in the economy since January 2020 on our deficit projections, experiences, and projections, more than all of it is due directly to the cost of legislation itself, and the rest of it is actually improved. Okay, so we've had a very unusual situation, a very sharp recession, huge deficits, huge response, and we're projecting a very rapid recovery. Well, let me say one more thing about where that leaves us. So here are, if you accumulate deficits, you get debt. That is, the debt is the sum of all previous deficits accumulated, roughly speaking. And looking forward, you can put together everything I've talked about so far to see what's happened to projections of the federal debt. So in January 2020, we were projecting that we would rise from a debt to GDP ratio of around 80% in 2020 to just under 100% at the end of 2030, according to the CBO so-called baseline. Now, of course, I said we added 25% to the national debt in 2 years, and that explains the short run jump well over 100% in fiscal year, our current fiscal year 2021. But the other thing that's notable about this picture is the convergence of these two curves, at least in the next few years. And that's attributable to the fact that, number one, that the economy is growing more rapidly than was being projected in 2020 because we're recovering, but also the lower interest rates. And so the fact that debt service is lower, even with a higher debt, means that debt's growing less rapidly. And so it means that our debt to GDP ratio is not going to be as much higher as one might have expected from just being told that you've had deficits of 25% of GDP in 2 years. But then toward the end of this period, you can see that the curves begin to grow more in parallel, rise more in parallel. And that's because, in large part, number one, because the economic recovery will be over at that point, and economic growth will be pretty much what we were projecting before, but also because interest rates are going to be coming back up with the recovery from recession and stronger growth. And so the bonus that we're getting from low interest rates, well, the interest rates will still be low, but not that much lower than we were projecting before. And so this sort of gives us a picture of where we're going to, you might say, the jumping off point at the end of the decade. And the fact that the debt to GDP ratio is going up at the end of the decade is concerning. What it's telling us is that even with interest rates still below the economic growth rate for a while, and to the end of this period, the debt to GDP ratio is going to be growing. What that's saying is that even though we get a bonus, if the interest rate the government pays on its debt equals the growth rate in the economy in nominal terms, then a government that runs no primary deficits will just have a flat debt to GDP ratio. But the fact that the debt to GDP, and in fact, the government's going to be, the economy is going to predict it to be growing a little bit faster. The growth rate is going to be a little bit higher than the interest rate, which suggests you could even run a small primary deficit and not have the debt to GDP ratio grow. But those 3% of GDP primary deficits that I showed you before are bigger than that. And that means that even with a bonus from having low interest rates, we're still going to have growing debt to GDP ratio. Now, how much, you can see from the pictures here that the growth is unlikely to be ending in 2030 if we stay on the trajectory we're on. And in fact, the trajectory we're on is likely worse than this because, to go back to something I said before, the CBO projections are based on certain conventions, and the conventions are that current law holds. Now, our current law at the moment includes a lot of things that may not be realistic. For example, when the large Trump tax cut was passed in 2017, it included a lot of temporary provisions. Some changes were permanent, like the reduction in the corporate tax rate. Many of the tax cuts were temporary, and that was done to deal with the budget reconciliation process, which has come up again in the current discussion. Congress can, the Senate only needs a simple majority to pass a budget if it's done through the budget, any kind of fiscal measure, if it's done through the so-called budget reconciliation process, which happens once a fiscal year. However, there are certain additional rules that apply to the budget reconciliation process, such as not having deficit, if you go beyond 10 years, not having the legislation increase projected deficits. The only way to make that work is to have things blow up, expire sometime before the end of the 10-year period. So the Trump tax cuts have a lot of these funny features in them, which were not intended as a policy measure, but just we're stuck in there to adhere to the budget reconciliation process and make it possible to pass the Trump tax cuts with a scant majority in the Senate rather than 60 votes. We'll see that again in the coming weeks from the Biden administration's proposal. But if you undo that and say, well, let's assume that Trump tax cuts stay in law, and let's also assume that discretionary spending grows more, the way it has historically rather than the way it's done by convention with CBO, then you get this dotted line, current policy rather than current law. And the current policy particularly begins to make a difference toward the end of the current decade, because that's when the Trump tax cuts start to expire. And then if one goes beyond 2030, as my co-authors, Bill Gale, Byron Lutz, and Louise Shaner, projected in a paper in September based on CBO projections, longer term projections at the time, you get deficits that are higher than those being projected by CBO, simply because of changes in conventions. And if you accumulate those, you obviously get a higher debt to GDP ratio, and it continues to diverge from the CBO path simply because the deficits are bigger every year, and the debt service attached to that just causes the debt to grow that much faster. And so by 2050, if one is so bold as to make predictions that far, you get debt to GDP ratio of around 220%. Now you might say, well, at what point do we go off the rails? Well, it's hard to know. The largest debt to GDP ratio in history that we've experienced was in 1946, with all the accumulations of debt in World War II, and that's close to where we are right now. We're over 100%, and so it's hard to know what all this implies. But one final piece of the puzzle, you might say, in terms of thinking about where we should go in the future, has to do with, and another thing that's unusual about the current recession has to do with the effects of fiscal policy on the economy. We normally think that when the economy is not doing well and we have a big increase in spending or tax cuts, one of the reasons we're doing it is to provide fiscal stimulus. Someone often talks about these fiscal measures as stimulus packages. So the biggest stimulus package, if one wants to use that terminology, we've ever had as a share of the economy in absolute terms was in March. It was understandable why we wanted to have such a big package. This is personal income from the Bureau of Economic Analysis, and you can see it. The market income, that is the receipts of households, excluding things like Social Security benefits, that is transfer payments from the government, just looking at what people receive from their market activities, personal income dropped very sharply in the second quarter. We know that. If you look at the effects of the government's key measures adopted under the CARES Act, it's remarkable what impact they had. So here is the same market income, and I've added on unemployment compensation and other government transfers. Other government transfers exclude things that like Social Security benefits, Medicare, and Medicaid. So it's a catch-all term. And in normal times, if you look at the quarters leading up to 2020, they contribute something to personal income, not a lot, maybe 0.5% and maybe $500 billion on an annual basis. In the second quarter of 2020, transfers were so large that they not only offset the declines in market income that households had, they actually went farther in the other direction. That is, the income that households got as a result of these relief or stimulus measures led them to their income going up a lot rather than going down. And then if you add in all the other components of personal income, both the additional transfers people get, like Social Security benefits, as well as subtracting the taxes that households pay, you're left with a disposable personal income, which is a measure we often use to sort of talk about purchasing power, what we think households will spend. So in a normal recession, you would have said, gosh, we more than offset the income losses households had as a result of the recession. We'd expect to see them maintain their consumption, perhaps even go out and spend some of this bonus that they got. But instead, what we saw was that personal consumption went down. And it went down even more than market income went down, despite the fact that disposable personal income went up a lot. And this doesn't happen in a normal recession. Now you might say, well, there's more uncertainty. People are saving more than they normally would because they're not sure what's happening. There's probably some of that. But most of what happened was that people were constrained in what they spent. People weren't going to go on vacations. They weren't going to, book a cruise because they had more income, because it was dangerous. So a combination of things being dangerous or simply being closed because it wasn't possible to operate them in the pandemic led to a decline in personal consumption. So the economy recovered, as you see from the increase in personal consumption and the increase in market income, but it wasn't necessarily attributable to the stimulus provided by the CARES package, because the spending increased. The increase in spending as a result wasn't really that big. Now, one final piece of the story before we turn to current events has to do with state and local governments. We normally think in a recession that state and local governments get hit too, and that may cause an additional drag on the economy. One of the key things about state and local governments is that unlike the federal government, they can't run ordinary deficits. They may be able to incur deficits for capital spending, but in terms of current operations, they generally have very strict rules that keep them from running deficits, or if a deficit appears, they have to deal with it pretty quickly. In the financial crisis a decade ago, that contributed to a drag on the economy because as state revenues and local government revenues went down, governments had to lay people off, cut spending on other programs, and that weakened the economy further. And there was a lot of concern in this recession that that would happen too. This is a picture of the effects by state, again from my paper with co-authors in September, predicting at the time that the revenue losses would vary across states and be sizable, but not necessarily sizable given the recession. If one looks at employment over the over a calendar year 2020, for the public sector as a whole, a state and local sector as a whole, it went down about as much as the private economy, but actually that was concentrated in education, where, as we know, declines in employment, a lot of them had to do with the fact that the schools weren't operating. Again, not necessarily because government didn't have the money, but because it was the economy, parts of the economy were closing down. If you exclude education, employment losses in the state and local sector are about half as big as a share of employment as they were in the private economy. Another thing that helped state and local governments during this period was the aid from the CARES Act. If you look at the transfers that state and local governments got from various components of the CARES Act, it actually covered a lot of, perhaps at least 1 year's worth of losses that state and local governments had in terms of their revenue losses. And another reason it was able to do that was another unusual aspect of this recession was how unevenly it hit people in different income groups. It's often the case that lower income people's incomes are more sensitive to the business cycle than higher income people's. But it's especially true in this recession. And people in the top of the income distribution really haven't suffered noticeably in terms of their incomes. And for states that rely on higher income people to pay their taxes, and California is an extreme example of that, it really doesn't make much. It really hasn't had, it's the declines in revenue that one might have expected from the declines in economic activity in the middle part of 2020 have been smaller than we would have expected. And indeed, it turned out to be even smaller than we were projecting in September. You may recall that Governor Newsom discovered $15 billion in the $15 billion bonus in the California budget late in 2020 because revenue had gone down so much less than was being projected by them in the spring and even by us in our paper in September. So where does that leave us for the current situation? President Biden's proposing a $1.9 trillion fiscal package, sometimes called a stimulus package, sometimes called a relief package. Well, if we think about it in terms of a stimulus package, it's useful to compare it to the sort of size of the hole in the economy that we might want to fill. Most of the provisions of the Act take place in fiscal year 2021, our current fiscal year, or 2022. If you look at the GDP gaps projected, that is the difference between potential at full employment and actual output, CBO is projecting a gap of about $500 billion in 2021 and about $250 billion in 2022. So that's $750 billion. And yet we're proposing a stimulus package, fiscal spending of 1.9 trillion. So if you were just saying, well, how much of a stimulus do we need to fill that hole? It would depend on what you think the fiscal multiplier is. I would argue that in normal recessions, based on my own research and the research of others, that a fiscal multiplier of around 1, that is increases in GDP of about 1, would certainly be reasonable, not unusually optimistic in a recession. And that would suggest that our fiscal stimulus is about 2.5 times what it needs to be to deal with a recession. And that has led some people to express concern that the economy that this might be too much of a stimulus. On the other hand, as I showed you before, this isn't a normal recession in terms of multipliers. The spending in the spring that increased disposable income substantially didn't lead to additional spending. So on the one hand, it might not be too big as a stimulus because it might have not have much of an impact in terms of stimulus. But then, if it isn't going to have an impact on stimulus, and if that's not why we're doing it, if we want to call it a relief package rather than a stimulus package, then one wants to think about the components. And here I think what comes to mind is Rahm Emanuel's quote during the last recession about not wanting to waste a crisis. And so I think one should think about the current proposal as having on its agenda more than just dealing with the current recession. Now, there are certain things in it, such as an increase in the minimum wage to $15 an hour, which clearly are not related to the current recession, but more to the Biden policy agenda more broadly. But there are other things. That minimum wage has small direct impact on the budget, on the federal budget, but other things have a much bigger impact. The $1,400 payments to individuals, which will go up to families earning as much as $200,000 a year, that accounts for over $400 billion. There's a over $100 billion increase in the child credit. $350 billion in aid to state and local governments, which, as I suggested, have done better in the current recession than we might have expected, and so far have had, in the aggregate, have probably had their losses covered, although not for every state. So there's more going on here. Those measures I just mentioned account for about half of the $1.9 trillion. Now, there's a lot in there that few people would argue with. Aid for education to get schools running again, money spent to help vaccination. Who would argue with that? But I think there's a lot in here that reflects more of the Biden policy agenda broadly, rather than dealing with the current recession. And so it leaves one to ask, well, how much of this can be afforded? What other things? There are a lot of things the Biden administration has indicated it wants to do, such as infrastructure spending. How much can we afford this? How much more can we afford? What should we be doing about tax policy? What other pressures are going to come to bear to make it difficult for us to do what's being proposed and more on top of that? Well, it's useful to think what's underlying those primary deficits that are rising that I showed you before. And the most important element is entitlement spending. Here's the CBO projections from September through 2050 for the three main entitlement programs as a share of GDP. And they're basically going up by about 4% of GDP between now and 2050, Social Security, Medicare, and Medicaid. So a way of thinking about it is if we're trying to sort of keep things the way they are, leaving aside the recession, we've got to find 4% of GDP on an ongoing basis to offset these things. Now, in the past, we've often said, well, we'll deal with entitlements. That's a separate issue, and we all agree we have to deal with entitlements, and we shouldn't, conflate that with dealing, with other parts of the budget. But I think one really shouldn't separate them. And I think, if anything, there's probably a stronger impetus for expanding these programs than for cutting them as a result of the recession. There was proposals particularly during the Democratic primaries to expand Social Security. If anything, the experience of the recession we've had and how certain families were not only affected, but had a lot of uncertainty about their future earning capacity. If anything, I think it leads to people to want a stronger safety net, not a weaker one. And if we just take that as given, we can't just say, well, we'll deal with these entitlements and everything else is fine. If anything, expanding entitlements may also be part of the policy agenda in the coming years. And so we're not exactly sure how we're going to, we can't just say, we put this aside and say, we'll deal with that later. Now, of course, revenue is part of it. If we go to current law, which has a lot of the Trump tax cuts expiring rather than current policy, it would bring us back to about 18% of GDP. That's historically where we've been, and that isn't enough. And so we really, even if we let the Trump tax cuts expire, much more would need to be done on the revenue side if we want to deal with deficits that way. We may want to deal with them on both sides of the budget, but clearly what we have now, even if we sit on our hands and let the Trump tax cuts expire, is not enough. And then the final piece of how long we have to deal with the problem is this bonus we're getting from the fact that interest rates are very low. And here's the news from the latest CBO projections of 3-month and 10-year treasuries, and the interest rates on those relative to the nominal growth rate of GDP. And remember, as long as interest rates are below the GDP growth rate, you can finance some of primary deficits without actually having a debt to GDP ratio rising. And this projection suggests that bonus is going to go away sometime at the end of the next decade. And then we'll actually have to move debt service to the other side of the ledger and actually add it to the debt to GDP ratio rather than having it help us address primary deficits. Now, some skeptics would say, CBO and all other forecasters have been wrong about interest rates for many years, always projecting that they'd be higher than they turned out to be. Well, there's sort of a natural constraint here. Interest rates are pretty close to zero right now. It's true we're projecting them to rise, but we're not projecting them, CBO isn't projecting them to rise very much. And they could stay lower for longer, but it would be an extremely, I think, unexpected event if the economy is to continue growing the way it's being projected for that to be the case. So where does that leave us? Well, this is the hardest part of my talk because I'm not sure. People often say, well, we should deal with long-run fiscal problems through some sort of have the government put a commission together. Well, we've been there and done that. Governments have had commissions. Commissions have come up with sensible recommendations, none of which have been accepted. So that's not that. Commissions may or may not be formed. I would say, interestingly, given the situation we're in, there's no interest in doing that right now. Another thing people say is, well, look, sooner or later there'll be a fiscal crisis and we'll just have to deal with that. Well, there may be, but it's likely to hit other countries before it hits the US. The US is still a safe haven relative to other countries. Other countries like Europe, for example, are dealing with fiscal problems probably bigger than the United States right now. And so it won't hit us. And if it hits others, it may actually help us because money will flow into the United States and keep interest rates on government bonds low. So if it's a crisis, it's not going to be in the near future. And commissions aren't going to have much of an impact. And there seems very little appetite politically on either side, Republicans and Democrats, to deal with it. I think the attitude among Democrats right now is that Republicans have been increasing deficits for several years, and now it's time for Democrats to do it. Not so much because they like deficits, but because they have an agenda that they want to deal with, and they don't see any way of doing it politically without incurring large deficits. And as long as markets let them do it, I think they will. And so that's where we are. And I'd be happy to come back in a few years and tell you what was wrong about what I've said now, and speculate further on when it will be that we'll deal with our fiscal issues. Thanks.
Thank you, Alan, for a great talk. I'm sure everybody really appreciates the objectivity that you bring to these matters. I wonder if I might just invite you for a moment, that last theme you were touching on, to bring in a little more passion, less objectivity, if you're so inclined. So at one point you mentioned going off the rails or fiscal crisis, but it sounds like you're personally really not worried about this, and you think regular people shouldn't be worried. Is that your bottom line? Yeah,
I think that Italy may have a fiscal crisis, although they have a prime minister now who is likely to navigate their fiscal situation better. Individual countries may. Certainly, countries outside of the most developed economies, or Argentina, other countries are having fiscal problems. I think unless something major happens in the U.S. economy that's different from what we're projecting right now. For example, another deep recession very soon. I don't really see, or spending even bigger than is being projected. My guess is that there's going to, if the Biden relief plan passes, I think there will begin to be pushback, even from some Democrats, in response to proposals for other large spending items, such as for infrastructure. And my guess would be that those will have to come with tax increases as well. And then we'll get into the less popular, politically less popular discussion of whose taxes increase. President Biden proposed increasing taxes on people with incomes over $400,000, and that may or may not be part of what's being proposed. We'll see how far he can go with that. But I really don't. I think there's more likely to be some pushback that slows down the expansion of deficits than a fiscal crisis in the coming years.
Thanks. So the number of great questions from participants. Let's see, Don Billings, you had some technical questions, which we were fortunate to have Valerie Ramey, who's on the CBO advisory board, answer. Did you get your questions answered, or Don, did you want to bring up some other issues?
I did, but there is a broader question, which is about the $1.9 trillion package and the advisability of another round of helicopter money, given your comments about the multiplier and how much of that money gets saved because it's not targeted where it's needed.
Well, if I were designing the package, I would sharply reduce the income level at which transfers are paid for two reasons. One, as I said, the unevenness of the recession You know, one of the, you might say, well, gee, if you're increasing unemployment benefits as is being done in the legislation, why do you need to also give transfer payments to families? I think a fair response to that is, you know, there are a lot of families where income is down for other reasons, such as declines in labor force participation. One of the things we know is that with schools closed, it's been very hard for working mothers to work, continue to work, and many of them, and the labor force participation of women especially is down. So you could argue that even if they aren't showing up as officially unemployed, there's income losses. Again, that tends to be concentrated away from the top of the income distribution. And I think you could easily reduce the payments by reducing the income level. Of course, that makes it less popular. And I think the popularity issue is one of the things driving the high income cutoff. As I said, I think aid to the states, well needed by some states, I think is probably overly broad. $350 billion for the state seems like a large number. You know, same with increases in the child credit. So I think in general, if one were saying, what do we need for stimulus? What do we need for relief? I think you could sharply reduce the overall size of the package without having much of a negative economic impact. You know, in different times that might be something that's done. There's really no political sort of nothing on the other side. No credible. I think the Republicans have more or less you know, don't have the same credibility in terms of fiscal responsibility that they might have had in the past, and so I think you know, Democrats who are putting forward the legislation don't really feel any political cost in proposing it. And you know, given that interest rate projections are so low right now, there doesn't seem to be the same kind of immediate economic cost there might otherwise be.
Thanks. John, your question was answered or not?
Yes, I think the principal problem is that money is free, so there's no political discipline, and until the bond market provides discipline, there's nothing to constrain the politicians.
Okay. John Reese, did you want to add a question or not? No. Okay. So Gabriel Mass had a really great point. Do you want to unmute yourself, Gabriel?
Sure. Yes, I was just wondering how being the reserve currency in the context of a fiat currency world, which is obviously very different from decades past, plays into the ability of the US or really any country who is in the position of being a reserve currency that can kind of, you know, self-finance deficits basically through transfers between the Fed and the Treasury. Well,
there's a.
I mean, it's very different than like Zimbabwe or
it's not that different. I mean, it's certainly true that the U.S. gets an advantage in terms of a lower interest rate by being the reserve currency, because there's a lot more demand for dollars and dollar-denominated assets, which keeps U.S. interest rates low, helps keep U.S. interest rates low. But that can change. You know, it's true that the U.S. isn't Zimbabwe, but it's not simply because we're a reserve currency. If the U.S. started behaving in a way, I mean, it's not simply deficits. After all, Japan has run deficits and had a debt to GDP ratio higher than the United States and had lower interest rates, and it simply had to do, among other things, with the fact that Japan it was credible that Japan would not default on its debt. If you had taken Japan's debt to GDP ratio and stuck it in Zimbabwe or Argentina, the result might have been different in terms of the inflation rate and the willingness of people to hold the government's assets. There are various fringe theories around, one called modern monetary theory, which I don't think accurately describes what it is, which says that governments that issue securities in their own, issue liabilities in their own currency don't have to worry about the budget. That may be one of the ideas that's currently driving or helping to justify what the federal government is proposing, but I don't think there's very much buy-in into that theory from the economics profession. You know, if the interest rates on government debt could change, you know, in terms of thinking about what might happen, you know, debt service right now is projected to be well below 2% of GDP, and as long as it's or less than 10% of the federal budget, as long as it stays that low, it doesn't really impinge that much on what the government spends on other things. If interest rates creep up, given the size of if the debt to GDP ratio is 1, which it is now, each percentage point increase in the interest rates the government pays adds 1% of GDP to the debt service. That's a large number, and I'm not saying interest rates are going to go up by 1 percentage point right away, but that means that even fractional increases, even in basis points rather than percentage points, could have a significant impact on debt service as a share of the federal budget. And I think that might be where the government begins to get the message that it should be doing something.
I don't want to take us too far into the weeds here, but I want to pursue one aspect of what Gabriel was saying. I mean, one part of his question, I think, is if you don't want dollars, where do you go? And yesterday we saw Bitcoin, what, $50,000. Do you want to comment on that at all?
I resolved, particularly when you said that you're going to have another speaker on investing, I resolved that I wasn't going to say anything about Bitcoin, coin, or GameStop. But I don't know. Bitcoin is making economists look bad, I think, because economists have said that, in order to be to serve as a currency, to serve as a money or a money substitute, it has to be a stable store of value, which Bitcoin certainly isn't, and it has no government backing. Economists used to explain Bitcoin by saying that there were certain transactions that people wanted to conduct without the government being able to see what they were doing. Illicit, basically black market transactions, and that was what was fueling Bitcoin. I don't know what's fueling Bitcoin.
I just wonder if one thing might be it's not $1, but
it's definitely not $1. But I guess if I were looking for something to put my money in and I weren't worried about the government seeing what I was doing, I think I might choose another currency. I might choose euros or yen, and I think before I would choose Bitcoin.
Yeah, well, I want to make sure, because Will Beamer had a really great practical question. Will, do you want to take the mic?
Oh, thank you. Yeah, I was just curious about if you had any thoughts on the potential timing for tax increases. I mean, it certainly seems like revenue increases are a pretty critical part of this picture. But I wonder whether, is that likely to happen in 2021 in the midst of, us still recovering from this recent pandemic-led recession, or do you anticipate that gets pushed out till early 2022 when obviously you've got midterm elections looming?
I think you've identified the conundrum. If you think about the Obama administration, everything happened in the first 2 years, and I'm sure the Biden administration is thinking about that too, because of the 2022 elections and the fact that the House and the Senate are very closely contested. And all they need to do is lose one of the two houses to basically make it impossible for them to do anything in terms of tax increases. On the other hand, having a tax increase in an election year doesn't seem like the right script written by a political advisor. So I don't know. I think they might, one can think of certain selective tax increases that might be broadly popular. But they haven't, I go back to the Obama administration and think about proposals, for example, to increase taxes on carried interest and other things like that, which they thought were, widely popular, and they couldn't get that through. And that wouldn't have raised very much money. Increases in the estate tax. There are other things that they might try, but they're really tiny in terms of the amount of revenue that they provide. In order to raise a lot of revenue, they have to increase income tax rates. They might push through a small increase in the corporate income tax rate. But again, I don't anticipate very ambitious tax increase proposals from the Biden administration. If they are fortunate enough to control both houses after the 2022 elections, then I think we might see tax increases.
We have time for one more question. Valerie Ramey has been very active in answering some of the issues and is one of the real experts on this, along with Alan Auerbach. Valerie, do you have any thoughts to add to what we've been saying?
I just wanted to ask Alan, to what extent does it matter when we're looking at these debt to GDP ratios, how much of the debt is owed simply to your own citizens versus to foreigners? Because my understanding is Japan has a much higher debt to GDP ratio, but most of it's owed to its own citizens. So the whole idea of sovereign debt default is not such an issue. And I was wondering if you would comment on that.
You're certainly right. When I said that Japan was credible with a high debt to GDP ratio, that's part of the story. But another important part of the story is the fact that the vast majority of Japan's debt is held internally. I think as long as the U.S. Looks good relative to other countries, as long as the U.S. is the reserve currency, and I think we're farther away from being overtaken by another currency than we were 10 or 15 years ago. I don't think that's going to change. There's all this concern about, well, it's governments and central banks, and what if China or Japan, Bank of China or Bank of Japan pulls out of treasuries? It's not really in their interest to do that. And so I think, unless there's some major international political disruptions, I don't really see that. It's a potential problem, but I think it's not a short-run problem that the U.S. is facing.
Okay, I know there are lots of other great questions waiting there, but what we'll do now is what we used to do back in the faculty club, where we'll break into smaller groups and maybe continue some of the discussion. I know we've set the stage today for April 16th, talking about the behavioral finance side of things. So hope to see you all there, and watch as you're now transported to another smaller room if you care to continue discussing.